rage, anger management, and plans? In today's episode of Shattered Legacies Deep Dive, we're going to be covering another one of the major factions. And as utterly bizarre as that intro was, it is very relevant as we are talking about the Berramon. Now, there isn't as much lore about the other factions as there is compared to the humans and the Ciritans. They're kind of the two factions that I've focused the most on. That doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't lore for the other factions, but it's not nearly as much. Suffice to say, I'm gonna have to really try to get these videos to at least an hour long, because there's information, but like I said, there's not a lot of it. But of course, we're getting off track. What are the Berramon? Well, the Berramon, I originally created them during this weird little in-between area where I was absolutely obsessed with Halo Brutes. I don't know, it was like a phase. It was weird. Just non-stop there for a while. I was completely and utterly focused on the Brutes. And I decided, okay, let's take the idea of the Brutes and let's mix it with Warhammer 40k orcs and see what happens, and then give them this really weird technology. And it ended up coming out pretty nice, I'm not gonna lie. Obviously, it's not a straight rip of either one, but it has interesting combinations of both factions. But of course, what are the Berramon? The Berramon look very similar to Halo Brutes, actually, but obviously they're not identical. They are a bipedal entity that stands roughly the same height as normal humans, so it's about a foot shorter than your average Ciritan. Ciritans standing usually on average around 7 feet tall, compared to the humans between 5 and 6. It should be noted that Berramon possess an enormous amount of fur all over their body, and this is largely due to the fact that they are a species that isn't that far removed from their primitive ancestors. What I mean by that is this. If you believe more in science rather than religion, you may end up believing and agreeing with Darwin's theory of evolution, that we essentially came from monkeys. If we go way back, technically lizards or some weird shit from the primordial goo that was Earth. I don't know. I haven't gone that far back. But anyway, in our past, if we're talking about the theory of evolution, our ancestors actually had fur on them because they evolved from monkeys, or at the very least, a form of ape. And as a result, the Berramon are very similar, but they haven't quite grown out of that still have fur on my body era, you know? They possess fur on their heads, their backs, their limbs, and their groin area. However, their stomach and their chest are completely bare of all fur. And these guys, even if it's the laziest of all Berramon, they're all pretty much jacked. Like, whenever you see them, they at the very least have a 4-pack. These guys are jacked beyond belief. And they don't have to do anything. They don't have to train to keep up this physique. It's wicked. Furthermore, their fur is typically brown with a silver sheen to it. Almost like a silver pearlescence. Now, obviously, we're not here really to talk about their physiology. We're here to talk about their society and their technology, most importantly, because that's, in my opinion, the more interesting thing. So this is where the Warhammer 40k orc comes in. Specifically, the fact that within Berramon society, might makes right. If you're the strongest, you're in charge. But of course, Berramon don't grow like orcs do. Orcs literally grow off of adrenaline. The more that they fight, the more excited they become, the bigger they get. Some of them up to a certain point, but some of them, such as the Beast or Gaz, they don't seem to have an upper limit, and they just keep growing and growing and growing, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. whilst they don't have that, they do recognize strength. And as a result, whatever Berramon is the strongest is oftentimes the one that is in charge of everything. Now, when we had talked about Berramon capabilities, back when we were talking about magic, I had mentioned that the Berramon don't have access to magic, which is interesting because their technology is borderline magic in of itself. What I mean by that is Berramon are incapable of casting any spells. Furthermore, they cannot use... Wait, which one was it? I can't remember if it was the Bastillions or the Berramon, but one of them can't use spell stones, but they can use spell scrolls. And as a result, it's not unheard of for Berramon to actually use magic on the battlefield via magic scrolls. However, it's incredibly uncommon, actually borderline rare, simply because the Berramon don't really understand it, and because they don't really understand it, they kind of shun it, you know? It's the same thing with Warhammer 40k orcs. They can use las weaponry, but for whatever reason, orcs just typically avoid las weaponry, despite the fact that they do have energy weapons. But regardless, the Berramon well, I guess we should stay on society. Berramon have a sort of caste system. Now, obviously, we already know about the might makes right. However, there's two different castes within the Berramon society, and once again, this is very reminiscent of 40k orcs. And that is, there is the Builders caste, and there is the Warlord caste, kind of similar to the Florians. The Builders largely build machines of war for the Warlords to use in any battlefield. Another thing that we should talk about is further on their physiology, because this is stuff that I just remembered. Berramon have this unusual ability of being incredibly durable. I understand that I'm all over the place in this episode, but it's because I'm trying to remember really old lore, and I forgot to write down like a list of this is what you talk about, and then you do follow with this, and then you follow with this. I forgot to do that. This was very much last minute. But Berramon are incredibly durable, almost to an unnatural level, despite the fact that they're literally just flesh and bone. They have incredibly thick skin, their muscles are incredibly dense, and their bones are very solid and dense as well. In fact, their bones are significantly thicker than that of human bones. Furthermore, when Berramon receive enough damage, almost like if we were to apply this as like a video game, they get to like a quarter health or something like that. They enter into a sort of rage mode where they basically lose all sense of themselves and what's around them and just become completely detached from reality, entering a berserking state in which they will charge down anything that's around them, regardless if it's the enemy that they were previously just attacking or even their fellow Berramon that's standing right next to them. Whatever they see first, they will charge with reckless abandon, not caring about self-preservation, because at that point, they literally lose all sense of themselves and anything around them. However, this also causes the problem of when Berramon enter these rage states, you pretty much have to completely and utterly incapacitate them in order to take them down. You know, when you shoot somebody enough, you would assume that the pain would continue to mount farther and farther until you go into a sort of shock state, because your body is sustaining so much damage and releasing so much pain into your system that it just overwhelms you. The Berramon don't have this when they enter their rage state. It doesn't matter how many chunks, literal chunks. I'm not talking about bullet holes here. I'm talking about chunks of their body being blown off. They will continue to run until they are either killed or they're completely incapacitated. And interestingly enough, way back in the Siritan Empire's past, this actually necessitated the development of a new type of technology at the time. Now it's considered a bit primitive. But this was back during a time when the Siritan Empire largely only really utilized plasma weaponry. They didn't really have anything more advanced, and they ended up encountering the Berramon. Now, the Berramon are very, very focused on war. Ironically enough, so is the Siritan Empire. And the two just became thick as thieves in a massive galaxy-spanning war between one another. And the Siritans were getting their asses handed to them. Berramon technology largely hasn't changed all that much, and we'll get to what it is in just a bit. But the Siritan Empire was significantly weaker than they are nowadays. And as a result, they had to start developing a technology that was capable of dependably taking down Berramon warriors before they could enter that rage state, because their front lines were just getting absolutely annihilated by these Berramon soldiers entering into this berserk state. And as a result, they developed pulse weaponry. Now, we haven't really gone over the different type of technological tiers within the Siritan Empire, but we're going to, in this case, pulse technology. Pulse technology, as I just said, was a response to the Berramon, and it turned the war in the Siritan Empire's favor so thoroughly that it's one of really the only instances in which the Siritan Empire the Berramon have actually surrendered. This is practically unheard of. The Berramon will literally attack anybody for any reason for any amount of time until, like orcs, they get bored. And then they go and find somebody else to fight. It's almost impossible to make them surrender. And the Siritan Empire managed to do it with pulse weaponry. Now, nowadays they have enhanced or upgraded their technology from pulse technology, and as a result, the Berramon have kind of gotten their footing back and kind of just continuously have wars against the Siritan Empire, because now they're not using that annoying pulse technology. They actually stand a chance. If you count having half your body vaporized in an instant, a chance. Now, it should also be noted that back then, the strength of a Berramon warrior was enough. They still had casualties, but the durability of their skin was enough. And this is surprising considering back then the Siritan Empire was using plasma weaponry. Plasma weaponry, you can look this up. When plasma comes into contact with something organic, it instantly evaporates all of the water in the human body. It's gnarly. And as a result, the Siritan Empire was using this because at the time it was considered incredibly OP, and the Berramon would just basically shrug it off. Something about their biology prevented them from just getting insta-killed by plasma, and this is why they created pulse technology. Now, I've been dancing around it. What is pulse technology? In its simplest form, it is energy of an unknown nature compacted down into a very small sphere. This sphere is held in place by a containment field and is fired at the enemy. When the containment field comes into contact with anything, it instantly pops, as the containment field is incredibly weak, and as a result, all of that energy is released in an instant, and as a result, causes essentially like a micro explosion at the point of impact. Now, the Siritan Empire tried using actual explosives in the past. It's mostly reliable against the Berramon, but wasn't a surefire method. However, for whatever reason, whatever energy pulse weaponry is utilizing, it was absolutely debilitating to the Berramon. They would shoot the Berramon warriors, and even if it was just a glancing hit that maybe only took off their shoulder, which already sounds like an unbelievably gruesome injury, the Berramon would normally enter a rage state at that point. They've suffered a critical injury, they lose themselves to this rage and just start berserking at the enemy. But interestingly enough, more times than not, it would bring the Berramon warriors down. It wouldn't kill them, which was unfortunate, but it would bring them down, so it prevented them from entering this rage state. The Siritan Empire still have no idea why this is the case. Something about this specific energy resonance is having a incredibly agonizing effect on the Berramon. And it's honestly confusing that the Siritan Empire eventually decided that they're not going to use pulse technology anymore, let alone against the Berramon, which seemed to be a literal hard counter to them. However, the Siritan Empire, being the Siritan Empire, must have decided that for whatever reason, it was just more economical to use higher power technologies, despite them being debatably slightly better, but also being more expensive. Because whatever this energy is, it's present everywhere. Every single planet the Siritan Empire would go onto, this energy was in such vast quantities that pulse weaponry doesn't have magazines. It doesn't have energy batteries. It doesn't have anything like that. It quite literally absorbs the energy out of the air and thus essentially allows for unlimited firing. Technically, there is still a quote-unquote reload cycle where the energy has to be absorbed from the air, but this takes less than a second to achieve and allows for a substantial amount of firing to happen. Now, the Berramon technology itself is utterly bizarre because it's plant-based. Now, I understand what you might be thinking. This sounds incredibly stupid because if it's plant-based, surely I could just throw a Molotov at it and the Berramon would freak out because all their technology is burning. You would assume that, but the Berramon technology is utterly bizarre, and it's one of the reasons why the Berramon are honestly, compared to every single faction that exists, are probably the best for any planet they encounter. The reasoning for this is simple. For the Berramon, plants and nature are half of their technology. The other half is normal, like metal components, machinery. And as a result, they understand the importance of plants. And so when the Berramon end up settling on a planet, which is very rare because the Berramon are largely nomadic, but when they actually settle on a planet and call this planet is ours, it's branded as a garden world, because that's essentially what it becomes. The Berramon are so focused on ensuring that nature continues to grow so they can continue to prosper in their technology that, with humans and other human-like races, we don't have nature as a primary element within our own technology. It's only machinery and metal and components and stuff like that. And as a result, we end up gutting the planets and essentially start killing planets that they settle on in an attempt to get more infrastructure or more minerals, materials, whatever that may be. So as a result, a lot of times, especially with the human race in Shattered Legacies, planets eventually become essentially incredibly toxic, outright barren, or even outright radioactive as a result of their industry or resource gathering. Now, with the Siritans, this is a little less severe, but it's still damaging the planets that they're on. They care a little bit more about nature, but it's not nearly to the same level that the Berramon are, where they make garden worlds rather than forge worlds. Now, once again, you may be questioning the efficacy of using plants as technology, especially when it comes to space travel, because the Berramon are capable of going to different planets, and this is done by giant, what are known as arc ships. And these arc ships are literally made out of trees, like it's made out of wood. And obviously, you can obviously come to the same conclusion that anybody else would. Well, that doesn't sound very airtight. In fact, it sounds like the opposite of airtight. And you wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but you wouldn't necessarily be right. The Berramon have been doing this for an incredibly long time, and as a result, despite it being, again, like I've said 100 times at this point, plant-based, their technology is incredibly stable. And as a result, things like space travel via a giant wooden ship is possible. As for waging war, Berramon, like I said before, they didn't used to use body armor. Just their skin alone was enough to keep them alive and keep the attrition rates low enough for their own liking. However, as the Siritan Empire came out with the pulse technology, they started to have to think of different ways to counter it. And unfortunately for the Berramon, there wasn't really many options, but the Siritan Empire, being the Siritan Empire, eventually outgrew pulse and came out with plasmite. Significantly more, well, slightly more powerful, but also slightly more expensive, well, a lot more expensive. But the Berramon could actually handle this, but it was still an issue. And as a result, they started making body armor. Now, make no mistake, this isn't body armor like you would think any sci-fi show would have, you know? Like, head to toe, they're covered in armor that protects them against whatever types of weaponry is being used. No, it's like Predator armor, you know? Like the old Predator versus Aliens. Yeah, those guys. You know, the armor that, it's obviously armor, but it's not protecting anything vital. You know, it seems like it's more for aesthetic. It's completely and utterly alien to us because we just don't understand the concept of it. Why wear armor if it's not protecting anything that's vital? The Berramon are largely on the same level. Some of them actually have legitimate body armor that protects them, but these are oftentimes elite Berramon task forces. Now, as for their actual technology, it's a bit difficult to explain as their weapons themselves, once again, are partly plant-based. As a result, their weapons actually undergo photosynthesis, and this is one of the reasons why the Siritan Empire and a lot of other factions have kind of noticed that plants are so important to them, and as a result, they'll literally just pump the atmosphere of war zones with just insane amounts of smoke. And as a result, their technology simply doesn't work as well as it's supposed to. This seems like a hard counter, but compared to some of the weapons that the Berramon have, it's a mild counter at the very least. It inconveniences rather than nerfs. And as a result, the Siritan Empire don't really fully understand Berramon technology. It's not that they can't get samples of their technology. It's more so the way that they use organic life from plants in their technology is so incredibly foreign that even though they have samples of their weapons, even though they have samples of their armor, the Siritan Empire really doesn't understand it. And this is why I said that there's a sort of magical element to their science, because no matter what path of logic or science they attempt to apply, dogs barking, to Berramon technology, it just doesn't work. You know, it's like orc technology. When it's in the hands of an orc, it's devastating. But when it's in the hands of anybody else, it's literally junk. Like, it doesn't function at all unless it's in the hands of an orc. The Berramon technology is kind of similar. When their technology is left to its own devices, it rapidly grows to the point where it just basically becomes just normal plants with a bit of metal tossed in here and there for seemingly no reason, you know? Weapons and war machines that are based off of trees will actually become legitimate trees with just random bits of metal woven into the middle of the tree for seemingly no reason, almost as if the tree had grown around this piece of metal. And as a result, once again, it becomes very difficult for the Siritan Empire to really try and reverse engineer this stuff, because eventually, and it grows fast, like, the Berramon have some sort of chemical that everybody keeps on them, and every once in a while, it's almost like an injection, and they inject it into their weapons, and this prevents them from just growing out of control and maintaining their stability. So as a result, just like with orcs, when you're not an orc and you try to use orc weapons, it's completely and utterly useless, with the exception of something like a chopper or a stick bomb, because they're so fucking simplistic that it doesn't require orc psychic shenanigans, whatever the fuck goes on there. It's similar with the Berramon, how their technology isn't dogs barking, holy hell. It essentially becomes completely and utterly useless in the hands of anybody else because it just starts growing uncontrollably and incredibly rapidly. So, moving on from that, we get to their actual armor. And once again, like I said, it's armor, but it doesn't protect anything vital unless we're talking about, as stupid as it sounds, Berramon Special Forces, in which case they have actual body armor. However, again, it's largely organic and plant-based with little bits of metal. Now, again, this sounds like it'd be incredibly easy to deal with. Once again, just throw a Molotov at them. They'll turn into a literal walking wall of fire. Except for the fact that whatever they do to this organic material, because it's utterly bizarre, because nobody really knows where the Berramon came from, but the plant life that makes up their technology appears to come from their homeworld. It appears as though the Berramon are capable of gene editing this plant life to the point where it's about as close to metal as a plant can be. And as a result, despite the fact that, again, a lot of their war machines appear to be made out of wood, they don't really burn. It's like trying to burn steel. If it's not hot enough, it's not really gonna do a lot, Like, it'll warm it up, but it won't burn the steel. And it's very similar to that. So let's go on to some of their bigger weapons. The Berramon have what are known as super weapons, or atmospheric super weapons. Every single faction has their own version. With the Siritan Empire, they are the War Machines. And the War Machines are essentially Warhammer 40k Titans. Obviously rebranded for the Siritan's aesthetics, but nevertheless, that's largely what they are. They're Titans. They are the War Machines. They are the Imperium of Man's God Engines. It's very similar. The humans have something very similar to that, but not identical. The Berramon, on the other hand, have an utterly bizarre one that, once again, is largely plant-based. And it's known as a Scardex. And these Scardexes appear to be modeled after an actual creature that exists within Berramon society known as a Scardix. Now, Scardix are really weird. The Berramon use them for almost everything. They use them as pets. They use them as beasts of burden. They use them as war beasts. Hell, there are even some that are used in medical situations as well as even food supplies. It's basically the orc equivalent of squigs, only way bigger. They essentially very similarly resemble a ferret. However, these ferrets are like legitimately standing on all fours. Their shoulders come up to the shoulders of them. So they're like a good 5 feet tall when they're standing on all fours. They're fucking massive. And interestingly enough, they also have a completely furred tail that comes to a scorpion stinger almost. Scardix are literally, like I said, they're used for everything. And once again, the Berramon appear to be gene editing the species, as the toxin that is in that stinger has multiple different purposes. Some of them are quite literally a sort of high nutrient paste that they use as a food source. Some of them have a hyper regenerative medicine inside of them that they can just inject into their masters. Some of them are incredibly brutal neurotoxins that basically just literally start melting people from the inside out. They literally serve everything. And the Scardix was apparently so important to the Berramon. And once again, we don't know the origin of this creature. We know that it's organic. And what I mean by that is it's not a synthetic creature. It's not something, it's not like a homunculus. It's a naturally evolving species that has been edited in very minor ways by the Berramon. The Skardix, however, were so important that they literally made a war machine about it, which is the Skardex. Now, the Skardex is absolutely fucking massive. It's like the size of a Warhound Titan, which I think stands on average at like 40 feet tall. They are massive, and they are the Berramon's solution to anything that is particularly annoying. The tail, which it again looks just like the creature it was modeled after, its tail has a high density, hyper condensed energy beam in it that is capable of firing at anything and pretty much melts through just about anything in relatively short order. It kind of struggles with corrodium, but corrodium is also the miracle metal, so whatever. It's also incredibly durable and has incredible strength to it, which is a bit of a bizarre statement when we're talking about a war machine, or a machine of war. And as a result, something even like Seraton Empire's super heavy battle tank can easily be turned into a pancake just with one casual step from this thing. It also appears to have some sort of nature-based anti-air defense system to protect itself from atmospheric craft. Now, an important thing to know is that the Berramon have capitalized on pretty much every single form of combat, whether that be infantry to armor to even navy and super weapons, even in the void of space. But there's something about their technology that makes them almost completely and utterly incapable of creating atmospheric craft. And what I mean by that is like jets, like modern day jets. They aren't capable of really creating aircraft. They can create anti-air defense systems, but depending on what they're fighting against is basically like shooting cotton balls at the side of a barn and expecting the barn to suddenly explode as a result of the cotton impacting it. When the Berramon are fighting the Seratons, Seraton atmospheric fighter craft are fucking insane. They're literally just missiles with wings. That's all they are. And as a result, the Seraton Empire fighter crafts that are designed for atmospheric conditions have such incredibly powerful thrusters that they kind of violate the idea that if it's gonna fly, it has to be light. Like, these things are so heavily armored, but it obviously comes with a unique design. The underside of the aircraft and the front are incredibly heavily armored. However, the top side of the aircraft is almost completely barren of armor. And this is largely due to the fact the Seraton Empire largely utilized fighter craft as bombers and doing strafing runs and stuff like that. So as a result, having armor on the bottom of the aircraft makes a lot more sense. But again, these aircraft have such incredibly powerful thrusters that they move at insane speeds, and they have so much thrust that it doesn't really matter how much armor that they have. Now, obviously, there's still a semblance of realism here. They don't just have, like, a battle tank's worth of armor. But, for an aircraft that is flying around, it's, like, a shocking amount of armor. It's not anything compared to a battle tank, but... So as a result, when the Berramon are fighting the Seraton Empire, they just constantly get harassed by aircraft, because they don't really have a solid counter to it, unless they are sending in a Skardex. Now, these things are incredibly difficult for the Berramon to create, and it takes an incredible amount of time, because it is a lot of organic plant life. And as a result, it is a huge commitment to make one of these things. And as a result, when it comes to the Skardexes, it's basically, if we're going to do it, we're going to overdo it. Because we don't want to have to make another one of these things. Because they take so fucking long to make. Because we got to wait for all these plants to grow in just the right way to then be put onto the Skardex itself. As a result, Skardexes are just armored to an unreasonable amount. And as a result, they are fucking snail-paced slow. They take an incredibly long time to even just go a relatively short distance, but the amount of firepower that they can bring to any battlefield is shocking, despite the fact that really the only primary weapon that they have is that laser cannon mounted on the tail. Now, obviously, there is deck weapons all across this thing. You know, it's like the old... what's a good example? I don't remember. It's been a long time since I played the Wolfenstein games, the new ones. But I imagine that it's something similar like this, where it's literally like Halo Scarabs, how they have that like deck on the outside, and is basically just completely littered with stationary guns that any Berramon can literally just hop on and just unleash massive amounts of what are essentially plant-based bullets. Which, fun fact, their ammunition is horrific. Not only is it incredibly armor-piercing, but it even has caustic and acidic effects within it, so that when they actually punch through armor, it literally just, like, all that tender, meaty stuff on the inside that people are made of, yeah, it just starts liquefying them from the inside out. Like, it's horrific what their ammunition does. And there's 20 of them on one deck. And they usually have maybe 2 decks total. So it's literally just torrents of fire coming in every single direction. And then this giant fuck off laser cannon that is just like, I see a big wall. Bam! Wall's gone. Let's keep marching. And even if there's a wall there, I can just bring my foot up and just slam it down on top. Like, they are incredibly difficult to take down. And oftentimes the Civitan Empire has to actually deploy one of their war machines in order to deal with these things, or literally just blitz it from orbit. Because it's not a situation like in Halo, how Master Chief literally jumped into them multiple times and just like slaps a grenade onto the reactor and pisses off while it blows up behind him. You know, these things are designed to take immense amounts of damage. Not only that, but it's like you have the Berramon gunners that are on the literal stationary guns that are all over the decks. And then you have yet more Berramon warriors on the inside that can be deployed literally at any time. Like, it's literally like, again, think of Halo Scarabs. You know, how they have those literally completely open decks. And as a result, the Skardex can literally just put its entire center body down onto the ground, and the Berramon warriors can just flood out at any time and just attack anywhere. So it's not just a massive weapon of war, it's also literally a walking fortress that can just disgorge soldiers wherever it needs to. And then you have even more Berramon warrior because they are the crew that is piloting this thing and ensuring that everything is functioning the way that it does. Now, obviously, you have to be asking the same question that I have, which is, how the fuck do you power this thing? We don't know. The Berramon utilize some sort of weird chemical that they created that is largely organic, that they kind of just injected into this thing, and it just keeps moving, almost like a stimulant. But the fact of the matter is, the Civitan Empire really don't know, because if the Berramon even get the slightest inkling that the Civitan Empire is close to capturing one of these things, they literally destroy every single vial of this chemical, and it just seeps into the Skardex, and then it basically like supercharges the damn thing. And it just goes, again, like a Berramon warrior, it just goes on a blinding rampage against everything. Because one thing that we need to realize about these Skardexes is that, yes, they have pilots, but they also essentially have a sort of pseudo AI. You know, it's not real AI, but it's more like the organic material of the Scar decks is sentient to a certain extent. And as a result, this is why I said that it will go on a berserking rampage. The pilot will literally just like let go of the controls and be like, I cannot control this. And it just goes and just annihilates everything. And if you just so happen to be in front of it, good luck, Godspeed, pray to whatever god that exists that you worship, because you are not making it out alive. Now, let's talk about the final thing, which is Berramon aircraft. Or maybe not aircraft, but voidcraft is the proper word here. Berramon voidcraft are utterly bizarre. They literally look like giant flying trees without the leaf bush on top. I don't know how to really explain that better. That's a really bad way of explaining it. A giant tree without the leaf bush on top. Like, what? They basically look like tree trunks. They're absolutely massive. They're capable of void travel. They're completely airtight. And, as if that wasn't enough, they don't require air filtration systems because the ship itself, just like a real tree, produces oxygen. Now, granted, normally that's with the leaves, but on the inside of these vessels, it is green. Like, literally green. Because there are vines, and there are leaves, and there are flowers, and plants, and crops, and just every fucking thing that you can imagine that is a plant on the inside of these things. And as a result, they don't possess an FTL. They can use the interstellar highways, sure, but they don't have a form of FTL. In fact, they have very rudimentary forms of thrust, which is basically the ship fills a pocket of itself with hypercondensed air and then basically just, it's such a bad way of saying it, but it basically just farts it out the back and just launches the ship forward. But it's weird because their technology, seemingly by its very nature, ironic, I know, no pun intended, doesn't follow the laws of physics. What I mean by that is they have, again, these sudden bursts of acceleration, but despite the fact that within the void of space there is nothing that should be causing drag, nothing that is causing friction to slow down the ship will just start slowing down. And so then they have to wait for these air pockets to refill again and then burst out the back so that they can get launched forward again. They basically just do these little hops over and over and over again. Nobody can really explain why they slow down, because that's not how void travel works. There's no friction. There's no air to slow you down. There's nothing that is causing friction along the entire ship of the vessel. So as a result, a lot of times it is theorized that, or not theorized, but in void travel, especially nowadays, they'll use the thrusters to get up to speed, and then they'll just shut the thrusters off. Because as long as they don't hit anything, they're not going to lose speed. And so they just keep going until they need to start slowing down, and then they start using all manner of different thrusters to start slowing themselves down. So yeah, as a result, the Berramon in their void ship, it's incredibly self-sufficient because the Berramon are largely herbivores. They're actual omnivores. They can eat meat and vegetables, or plants, I guess. But they lean more towards the life of an herbivore. They eat a lot of different plants, which makes sense. Their technology is literally plants. And as a result, once again, even in the middle of a Scar decks, in decks that don't necessarily have, an open deck scheme, there's still plant growth inside of these things, whether they be producing oxygen or what have you. They still have crops and just random flowers and plants and ivies inside of their ship, or whatever it is that they're using. If it's a Scar decks, or hell, even some of their tanks and stuff, they still have plant growth in there. And as a result, they don't really require resupply ever. Obviously something for like water and medical supplies, yeah, they may require a resupply, but when it comes to like food and ammunition, their technology literally grows it and then uses it. And depending on what plant machine, I guess, they are using, they may have gene edited it so that whatever ammunition is being fired grows at such a massive rate that you can basically fire the damn thing like a machine gun and just fire infinitely. But so yeah, that's really all I have about the Berramon. There's probably a few things that I'm missing. Like I said, I made the Berramon a long time ago and kind of made all of this lore. This is very old lore. But I basically made all of this lore and then just never really grew on it. I mean, we've definitely had wars with the Berramon since I made that lore of the Berramon, but I haven't really added anything. So they're probably going to be a faction that will eventually receive a tune-up. New lore will be made. Various different things about what I've explained will be changed or upgraded or enhanced in some way, shape, or form. But for right now, that is the Berramon in a nutshell. They're a very interesting and very difficult faction to fight against. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope you guys are looking forward to tomorrow's... Wow, I completely forgot the name there for a second. I hope you guys are looking forward to tomorrow's modded survival, as well as Fridays, followed up by Saturday and Sunday, our live streams at noon Central Standard Time, where we will be doing RimWorld on Saturday and Sunday Night Live on Sunday, where I pick a random game and we just game it out for 2 hours. After that, we have the Monday 7 Days to Die episode, and Tuesday right back here with a brand new video. I honestly might do some of the minor factions or minor races. I don't know. We'll find out. Like I said, today's episode was very like last moment. I completely forgot to think about it, and then I got to work this morning and I was like, oh shit, I need to think of something. We've talked about the Certain Empire a little bit too much recently, and the first thing that popped in my head was Berramon. I was like, okay, we're doing that, and just completely ignored it for the rest of the day. So, yeah. But anyway, like I said, I hope you guys enjoyed. Until then, guys, see ya.